Okay, so today we are going to speak about the downside of boundaries. We've spoken a lot about the benefits of putting the boundaries in, but whenever boundaries are put in place, we could have a negative knock-on effect from that. So, would you like to start with
Yeah.
what that would look like, maybe?
So yeah, the ideal is really that we would think to ourselves, like we probably hear this from others in our little orbit, you know, become more assertive, put in boundaries, get more respect. And in an ideal world, you would. And in some cases you will get some respect. But the problem is if you challenge a narcissist with boundaries by giving them boundaries, you will likely get a very defensive reaction. And that defensive reaction can go really, it can escalate, it can go anywhere. So it can that so there's two things. They say that or maybe there's three. They say that narcissist will, you can tell a narcissist if you give them boundaries, because what will happen is they will either get angry and defensive. How dare you? Who do you think you're speaking to? Rage. Or they will disconnect emotionally and do what's called the silent treatment, and then that can create anxiety in the person who's trying to give the boundary. Or they will simply walk away and you won't see them anymore. It's obviously going to depend on what commitments you have together by that sort of reaction. But so it comes with it. This is where a lot of people have had negative experiences and maybe really early on in their life, and that's become part of their subconscious resistance to giving a boundary. And because it will feel unsafe because you won't know what the response is going to be until you've done it.
So that is literally why it's so hard for people to put boundaries in place because they know that if they do start to put boundaries in place, they're not gonna be safe. So it's almost better to just not put the boundary in place e- to feel safe, even though technically they're not safe.
That's right. So they're living in an abusive situation. They're not actually very safe. It's always going to be whatever mood that their perpetrator is in, what control they're trying to exert at the time. Um, but in what will have, those of us that have been people pleasers will have grown up thinking that as long as we don't push people too hard and we don't push our needs too hard, and we keep complying and doing what people want, we'll remain safe. So to step out of that and start saying, no, I have a limit here and I'm going to put something in place to protect myself, that starts to feel very unsafe. Now, to those that are practiced with giving boundaries, that is absolute safety. I put a boundary in, I've sorted the problem.
Yeah.
Um, but when you're dealing with somebody who has, it might be offended or defensive around putting in boundaries, you're going to experience a negative consequence. And some people, for some people, it's actually a risk. It's a physical risk. It's certainly an emotional risk.
Yeah, so in that situation, even though they are having to suppress themselves for that other person by not putting in their own boundaries. They might even not know what their own boundaries would look like because they haven't had the chance to put them out there or experience them. So
Yeah.
for them to live in that state, would would that it's not even the word okay, is it? It's like would that be it's not okay or it's not better for them. It's just all they know, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's all they know. And absolutely, because we would have had to, it's back to that thing, we would have had to have felt safe to give boundaries and to use them, but also we would have had to have had boundaries used with us for us to know how they work, that they're acceptable, that they're useful, that they serve purpose. And so for a lot of people, it'll be learning all about what boundaries are. So, I might first of all talk to somebody and explain that a fence is a boundary, a front door is a boundary. Um, and those are like the physical representations, but the when we're talking about being doing this with people, we have to tune in with ourselves and think, what's going on with me? Are my needs being suppressed? Do I actually need to put something in place, or am I feeling like I'm pulled into something I don't want to do? And that's when we need to put in the boundary. But that may well take practice, yeah. And the problem is, of course, if you're practicing with somebody who doesn't accept it and gets angry, that's going to put you off doing it again.
Yeah, because you're going to have a negative knockback from that.
Yeah.
So, so in a sense, like we spoke about the benefits that person can get from putting in these boundaries, but what if like the what is the negative so that would come from putting in that boundary? What would the negatives look like in certain contexts or situations? Like what could that show up as?
So, for an example, somebody who's in an abusive relationship with maybe the co-parent of their children. So I say relationship, but the relationship will have split up. Um, the we'll say the victim of the perpetrator, so we'll say that like we'll give her a she's tried to put boundaries that she's never been able to manage whilst in the relationship. She tries to put boundaries in whilst now not being in the relationship. And what will happen is the fury, the absolute rage and fury from the perpetrator, that the control that they've been used to having is now being curtailed, is now being they've been prevented from using that control. Then that becomes this. It can become this kind of terrible, like the reaction would be that they would put in more control. They'd become more controlling. So it's like it doesn't necessarily just quieten that person. It doesn't necessarily give you more respect at all. What it might do in the end, but initially that the perpetrator is going to have to get used to you changing your dynamic and putting in control mechanisms yourself and boundaries. And that can just escalate into all sorts of difficulties and problems, which is why abuse agencies will take a detailed risk assessment from each person that comes to them that has been experiencing an abusive relationship, because they'll have to check do the risk assessment around how safe they are. Because we know that it's a very dangerous time when trying to leave an abuser. And that this can be the same for somebody who's got parents who are narcissists or a parent that's narcissist. And it'll be unlikely that you've ever been able to have any boundaries with that person. And if you start trying, often I get clients come and say, boundaries just don't work with my mother or my father. They just don't work.
Hmm.
So what we do then is we work hard at toning down I'm going to keep using that word victim. We can also use the word survivor, um, but I'm going to use victim. So the victim then has to tone down their responses. If they can't work, if boundaries don't work, then what we do is we stop giving so much emotional responses, and that's called grey rocking. So
Okay.
we just and that's another form of boundary, which is like, oh, well, I'm going to boundary my responses so that I don't keep getting caught up into your emotional spin, your spiral.
Which is
Uh,
actually what they want, isn't it? They
that's
want
right.
that reaction.
That's their supply for negativity, negative responses. And then they can often get you caught into an argument or conflict, and then they'll be like, see, I told you you're the crazy one. I told you you're angry and you're the problem and you're the one that needs therapy.
Yeah.
When actually it'd be somebody just trying to defend themselves, or actually started off just trying to put in a boundary that would have helped themselves, or and then they've met with this really negative consequence. So there are very real consequences potentially for using boundaries, ones that can cause physical harm or emotional harm, or alienation of the children. If the co-parent can't get at you anymore, then and they have contact with the children, then they may well alienate the children against the victim of their victim. So it's dangerous. There are dangerous consequences, but the kind of that kind of we get into the fear bit here, but we also need to remember that there are higher authority boundaries that can help with situations like with co-parenting, and that looks like um, you know, uh, contact arrangement orders, or maybe restraining order. So then you get into like the whole legal stuff about
Yeah.
what power you can have legally, and then that can work to control somebody who's been a bully, basically.
Is there any like legal side, like so that's the legal side for the co-parenting. What about if it's just like you said, the parent and the child, like
Yeah, so
relationship?
that would depend on how dangerous it got, because everybody's got a right. I mean, it wouldn't matter what relationship you had in order to get a restraining order on somebody, as far as I know. I'm
Hmm.
not a legal expert, but this is from listening to people and
Yeah,
to hear people's stories. You can still put in some sort of protective order for yourself. So, but the other thing that people do is they'll often decide to go no contact. So that's like the ultimate boundary. The ultimate boundary of I don't need to experience your negativity, and that and I can actually prevent further damage to myself by going no contact.
yeah,
It's an incredibly brave thing for people to do because they're having to let their family go.
yeah.
What has been their
All they've
um
ever known.
yeah, like their sort of version of family, which might not be as supportive as other people's families. It might not be as nice and happy or anything, but they're still having to let go of that sort of the promise of that, or the ideal of that. So it's a big step, but that's what other people do. Yeah, that's what some
So
people
it's
do.
almost like the positive of putting that boundary in of the no contact has also the negative effect of, oh wow, like I've just cut ties and
Mm.
from that, however long that history is,
Mm.
that is like a almost like a grief or
Definitely.
well, even in the other context, that's still all of it involves the grief of the loss of what was known.
Yeah.
So yeah, so like every positive does have a negative, but then that negative can, like, things can be put in place to help you overcome those negatives.
Yeah, I mean, then there's the recovery process, isn't there? And that's going to look different for everybody, as we've spoken about before. So some people might go no contact and find the benefits completely outweigh any loss or grief, because there might be a massive relief or some freedom or a new beginning. Because often it'll entail moving some distance away, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
so that likely to run into the people, the person. Yeah, so it is going to be different for everybody, but definitely some loss, all right, that's the thing. It's like when a parent dies who hasn't that's another one that's like that, where there's the loss. So if a parent dies that hasn't been a good parent to you, um through their own limitations, there can be a lot of grief around that sort of the loss of the chance of ever having that parent be the parent.
Mm.
Uh, and
Yeah, so
that's
it's the loss of like what could have been rather than what has been.
exactly, yeah.
Um, then that can be, yeah, yeah, that's a whole nother interesting topic to actually go into. Um, so if somebody was to like let's just go back to the context of the parent and the child, so the narcissistic parent and the child. If 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 cutting complete ties was something that A, they didn't want to do or they were not ready to do, like, is there any other way? Like, so what did you call it?
Grey rock, yeah.
Gray
So
rock.
grey rock, there's another term for it, which has come from AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and codependent, the awareness around codependency. So people who've understood how to be more careful around being codependent to an alcoholic, they use this term disengaging with love, or it might be disconnecting with love. So it's like it's for people really who they might not want to hate the person. They might just want to kind of like get some distance from them. So it's
Yeah.
like that's also known as that. Grey rock is a term that's definitely associated with narcissists and not fueling that emotional supply, as we said. So not giving them their responses they're looking for. And there's another term which is yellow rock, which I've only just heard of recently, which is where it's more like just kind of a bit in between. So it's like becoming very aware of your responses and thinking about your response rather than being caught in that reaction.
Yeah.
Um,
So then the control is back in your hands, even though they think it's in their hands.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And just like that's a similar way, because no contact is the extreme version of, putting in a very extreme boundary. But there can be another way, which is modified contact or low contact, so that you disengage as much as you can. So it might be like, what can I do to make myself feel better about the situation, that I'm more in control? What I could do is just reduce how much I see that person. I might take the person, like say if there's a parent, I might take the person to a more public place where there's a cafe or something where they can't be so mean, so obviously mean. Or I might always have somebody with me that they'll perform better in front of. There's
Yeah.
ways of managing it where you can take some control back so that you don't have to necessarily lose contact altogether, but that you can keep it on your terms and keep
Yeah.
safer.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a positive. That those are like positive plays, basically, aren't they?
Yeah, they
Positive
are, yeah.
plays. Yeah.
Yes,
That wouldn't
yeah.
have so much of a negative effect if you were to actually like strategically plan it like that.
That's it. And that's what this is about, because everybody's different about how they manage these situations. And some people need to go really, 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 really carefully and
Hmm.
slowly
Hmm.
in order to exit from a relationship. And I've known
Yeah.
people take an awful long time to do it, but they've done it with no stress, not really. I mean, the stress was in dealing with the person, not the fear, the guilt, the stress of leaving. So they'll just slowly, 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 slowly disconnect from that person,
Yeah.
and that, like, even after they've ended the relationship, they can still continue with some text contact as a friend, something
Mm.
like that.
Yeah.
As long as they're really got good awareness that they're not going to get back into the dynamic with that person. So keep in control in that way.
Yeah.
And that
That
reminds me also of blocking. So when you block somebody on your phone, some people cannot do that. They think that must give them a lot of anxiety and fear that that person might need them and then they're not there. So then that's another way. So we say that, for some people that'll be that they'll be okay with that. They'll just block. It might seem severe, but they're like,
they'll
no,
be
that
able to
makes
manage that and not let it bother them.
yeah,
Whereas other
yeah,
people would be like, oh, like you said, what if this happens or what if that happens? And
yeah.
so it's like finding the way that works for the individual.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That makes them feel at ease. It's always like it would be wrong for me to bring in something like, oh, what you need to do is go no contact with somebody or block them, and then they get overwhelmed with anxiety and guilt. So they're replacing one set of emotions for another. That's no good, is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Negative
Yeah.
emotions. So what we want is that person to feel like they've got control over how they do it.
Yeah. Yes. And that, like you said, that way of the slowness of it,
Yeah,
they're such small steps that they don't have that impact. You don't notice the impact of the small
that's
step,
it.
but when the small steps are compounded, it's made massive progress, but with no impact.
That's
So that,
it.
yeah,
A really gentle way of doing it. Yeah.
yeah, and that you can flip that on the other side with growth in other areas, not just in this, but like growth in anything. Those
Mm.
tiny steps compounded, like all of a sudden you look back and you're like, oh, how did I get here without even realizing you were on like the way there?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um.
Manageable. It's like making it manageable, isn't it?
Mm,
Each side, each way there
yeah.
of
and
doing.
and and then the difference is like the individual basis, like everybody manages things in completely different ways, so it's
Mm,
literally understanding what the individual needs,
that's
or
it.
understanding yourself, understanding what you need, understanding what makes you feel like
Yeah.
you're able to do those things, and then
Yeah.
yeah, mapping out a little step-by-step roadmap.
Yeah.
So um I don't think there is an answer to this question, because is like there you can't again, you can't put it on the situation because it's such an individualized thing, but there are going to be cases where putting in boundaries is never going to be the right thing to do. Won't, well, won't there? Like there, because there'll be a case where it's the other side of the boundary is too dangerous. Would you say, or would
Uh,
that be where the small steps come into play? And
that's where the small
yeah,
steps come in, and
yeah,
grey rocking, and
yeah,
anything that helps you feel more. Yeah, I don't think we can say. Yeah, there are definitely times when people say, I can't do boundaries with my parent or partner or whatever.
yeah,
And yes, narcissists, if you've got to keep seeing them, you've got to keep them in your life, and it's going to constantly get that massive reaction. It is going to be tricky. So what we do is look at how to adjust what we give, what we provide in that, and cut that back, and then gradually grey rock that, and then that means that we are doing the boundaries with under our control. So it's ours, it's our own personal boundaries, really, what I'm prepared to keep giving to that person and reining that in.
yeah, yeah. So it all brings it back to again like that self-awareness of yourself,
Yeah,
the awareness of the situation, and then the learning and the education of what can better the situation, and then what you can do to better yourself and the situation. So it is again, it's just that whole awareness, isn't it?
yeah, it is awareness, knowledge, yeah, strategies, yeah,
Yeah, and support. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
and support.
yeah. Okay, perfect. Do you think there's anything else that needs to be added to this conversation?
Yeah, one more thing about guilt.
Okay.
Because we've talked about how, the way people react with boundaries, but we've not included that bit, which is actually goes on for a lot of people who've not practiced boundaries will feel a huge amount of guilt for putting in a boundary, because you know what you've just done, you've put yourself first, and that's going to be really difficult for a lot of people who are very used to putting other people's needs first. So, having worked with somebody who grew up in a Catholic family, guilt was very, very, very present all the time. And she used to recognize that guilt came in all the time. Anytime she wanted to do something for herself, guilt. Um, and the same with if she needed to put in a boundary, in come the guilt. So what we is that awareness thing again, so because guilt is a habitual response, to patterned behavior, so it's a part of our pattern behavior. It doesn't mean it's right. So we challenge it, we get to know it. When's it coming? Okay, what have I done to trigger it? I see, okay, where do I feel it in the body? Just recognizing all those things about it means that you have more control over it. So it's like, okay, I know what's happening. And the person that I was working with there, she had her own way of dealing with it, which included a sort of a little how do I put it? Like, she just had this action that she did, which helped her feel like she had pushed the guilt away. So, everybody's going to have their own way of doing it again, but and guilt, as I say, is not an easy one to shift
Hmm.
because it's so habitual. But it's becoming aware of it, recognizing it, challenging it in yourself. It's okay to put myself first. In fact, it's healthy to put myself first. And I can even be more present for people if I put myself first in at this time. So, it's not a selfish act to put yourself first, especially if you haven't done it for most of your life.
Yeah, yeah, that must be a strange feeling to like almost understand that you can put yourself first, and then like understand that like the benefits after feeling like that unease of
Mm,
like, oh, I don't normally do this, and then doing that, like the benefits and the knock-on effect and the positivity that comes from that.
that's it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And for those that are in difficult relationships that they're having to use those higher authority boundaries, that might take longer to get to that point of feeling the relief that you finally got there and got some boundaries in place with that person. And now there's a legal structure that prevents them. But it's worth it when you get there. That's the
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Is it might just take longer.
Yeah, so it's almost understanding, like, no matter, like, again, it's on the individual basis and on the context of the situation, but by putting boundaries in place, you're almost always going to come up against the negative, and then it's working your way through that negative, whether it's like takes a longer period of time, like certain steps to be in place. But on the other side of that, most of the time is the positive after the negative.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You get
Okay.
the reward.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Perfect. Is there anything else, or do you think
I
that
think
sums it
that's
up?
it. I
Yeah.
think that's it, George, for today.
Okay. Thank you, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, George.
Awesome. Thank you.